Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lincoln Davies, and along with my incredible colleague, Brig Daniels, I have the incredible honor and privilege of serving as the co-director of the Wallace Stegner Center. And it's my privilege this afternoon to welcome you all to our 20th annual Stegner Center Young Scholar Lecture. Okay, good. I'm doing things to the computer, but I'm not going to worry about it. I want to take just a moment to welcome you and also then to introduce our speaker. But before that, I want to also note that here at the University of Utah, we acknowledge that the land which is named for the Ute tribe is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationships that exist between the many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. I also want to take a moment just to highlight a couple of our upcoming events. Our next green bag, our series of green bags, which are always wonderful events, will be on November 21st at 12:15. A Watershed Moment, The American West and the Age of Limits, with book editors and contributors Evelyn Brister, Rochester Institute of Technology, Robert Frodman, an independent scholar, and Seth Ahrens, The Western Water Assessment, and Bonnie Baxter, Westminster University. So I hope you'll join us for that. And then also coming up on March 20th and 21st will be our 30th annual Stegner Center Symposium, so a big anniversary, and we'll be focusing on an issue very important to our local community and obviously nationally as well, air pollution. So the title of the symposium is Breathing Easier, Air Pollution Challenges and Solutions. So it's now my honor and privilege to welcome and introduce our newest and our 20th Stegner Center Young Scholar. The Young Scholars Program was founded in 2005 with generous support of the Cultural Vision Fund, which has provided annual support for this program. This program is designed to recognize and establish a relationship with promising scholars early in their academic careers. Recipients are selected based on their accomplishments, the quality of their academic work, and their promise in the field of environmental, natural resources, and energy law. Today, we are delighted to celebrate our 20th anniversary of this program, and please note our prestigious list of young scholars displayed behind me. And again, I want to thank the Cultural Vision Fund as the founding and sole donor for this program. So our lecture today will be delivered by Professor Joshua Macey from Yale Law School on regulating public utilities. Professor Macey is an associate professor at Yale Law School. He previously was at the University of Chicago Law School, and before that at Cornell. He, in 2023, was elected into the American Bankruptcy Institute as a 40 under 40 emerging leaders in insolvency practice. He writes at the intersection of energy, bankruptcy, environmental law, and energy law and policy. And he has thrice, so 3 different times, won the Morrison Prize, perhaps the most prestigious prize for writing in impactful energy and environmental scholarship, for his article Zombie Energy Laws, which was published in Vanderbilt Law Review, Long Live the Federal Power Act's Bright Line in the Harvard Law Review, and Clean Energy Through Grid Reliability in the Stanford Law Review. Professor Macey, I would argue, is perhaps one of the brightest minds writing in energy law and policy today, and it's my pleasure and privilege to welcome him to the podium at our law school. Thank you.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for coming out to listen to me. Often when I introduce public utility topics to folks who haven't sort of accidentally dedicated their life to this important field, I like to joke about sort of somewhat seriously that in 1917, when Felix Frankfurter was hired at Harvard Law School, he insisted that well, he called it regulated industries, but the course was 50% energy law, 50% railroad law, be the only required 2L course for Harvard law students. And he actually succeeded in this mission for 2 years. So I do think that, today we don't always think that public utility regulation is the sort of core of economic activity, but 100 years ago it was a sort of crucial facet of how we thought about basically government administration. And I don't know that I will convince all of you of that today, but hopefully there's some interest in the regulation of public utilities. So with that said, I was asked to talk about sort of in high-level broad research and also kind of more specific ideas. And so I thought it would be a kind of good time to provide a synoptic account of maybe some of the regulatory challenges with thinking about how to control utility behavior, and specifically why it is so hard to regulate public utilities. So this is kind of in broad strokes, the thesis, which is part one. There are unique economic and policy challenges that make it far more difficult to regulate rate-regulated utilities than ordinary corporate entities, and much of the talk will go into why that is the case. Thesis two is that the ordinary binary between external government regulations that adjust price and internal governance mechanisms, in other words, the means by which corporate entities make decisions, makes far less sense in the public utility context. I'll sort of harken back to some Chicago days, but to provide a brief preview, there's a theory about why corporate governance should be by and for the interests of shareholders. This is a theory I broadly buy into. It's typically associated with Frank Easterbrook and Dan Fischel, but I think the argument does not apply in public utility industries. And so that will sort of get at some of the interesting and unique intellectual challenges of public utility regulation. And then the third point, which follows once again from the view that it's really darn hard to regulate public utilities, is that we should possibly think of public utilities the way we think about systemically important financial institutions, where stress testing and capital requirements are a core part of regulation. But before we sort of get into the weeds, I want to just go over sort of some of the, maybe make this a little more visceral or real to some of you. I don't know if any of you can, some of these might be identifiable, but does anyone have a kind of thought about what these horrible pictures are? If not, okay, so the down transmission lines in the top left for you all is Entergy Louisiana's distribution and transmission lines that went down during Hurricane Ida. The wildfire is one of PG&E's wildfires that resulted in about $40 billion of liability. This thing is a nuclear reactor. It's the VC Summer Nuclear Station. What's interesting about this nuclear reactor is that it was abandoned after $9 billion were spent and is not going to ever be constructed. And the final large pit is Duke Energy Carolinas is responsible for the second largest coal ash spill in US history that led to a couple hundred deaths and about $10 billion in Clean Water Act costs. The reason these are relevant to the paper is that typically we think that liability is a means of deterring excessive corporate risk-taking or corporate misconduct. But what's notable about these examples is, sort of to go in reverse order, that Duke Energy paid $8 billion in cleanup costs and $2 billion in Clean Water Act liability, and the North and South Carolina regulators authorized cost recovery for about $9.8 billion. The nuclear reactor, if you live in South Carolina today, 14% of your monthly bill goes towards paying for an abandoned nuclear reactor. The idea, again, being it is the ratepayers, not the shareholders of the company, who have been saddled with these high costs. The wildfire We all know that PG&E was wiped out after catastrophic wildfires. What is sort of less well known is that shareholders of old PG&E were given warrants in new PG&E, which actually paid out considerably, such that the revenues provided by captive ratepayers ultimately resulted in significant profits. The shareholders were not effectively wiped out. They instead got a large stake in the new reorganized company. And finally, the down transmission lines is my favorite example. Entergy Louisiana was required by its state public utility commission to insure against the possibility of transmission outages. It was unable to procure insurance, and so it had its parent company, the Entergy, the parent, provide insurance. When it had $2.1 billion in wildfire in transmission outages that had to be repaired, it couldn't pay $2.1 billion, and so it was allowed to recover in rates $2.2 billion over a 20-year time horizon. Securitize that. So it went out in capital markets. It got debt worth $2.1 billion, and it guaranteed it from the repayment structure. The interesting thing, so once again, this sort of fits the narrative that ratepayers paid. But what's amazing about this, and this is not the core of the paper, is that Entergy actually, this gets a little financy, but said that its weighted average cost of capital was 10.5%. The company goes out and refinances that 3 months later at 4%, meaning Entergy profited $62 million for failing to maintain its transmission system and leading to weeks of outages and about 62 deaths. So these are kind of horrible stories. They're designed to get your kind of moral outrage. But the theoretical point I want to make is that it is the regulatorily authorized cost recovery is actually not all that surprising here because of the unique features of public utilities, and that it's very, very difficult to rely on ex post price-based deterrence the way we think about deterring in ordinary industries. And so we need to think about alternatives. So I'm going to, the basic argument, which I'm going to return to probably more times than you all want, but is that utilities are in a position to hold up their regulators. And what I mean by this is that we say we have all of, many academics, people, myself, people here I admire as academics have often said, we need to think about price-based various deterrence mechanisms. So we want a utility to do something, we need to bake it into the rate schedule. And my argument is that it's very, very hard to commit ex post to these incentive-based structures. And I'll return to this in more detail, but the kind of two arguments are, if you have a company that so the distinctive features of rate-regulated utilities is that they have a legal right to a monopoly, and their rates are determined by a regulator, unlike in an ordinary industry, where if I want to purchase t-shirts, if I don't like a t-shirt from company one, I go to company two. The company will theoretically, it sets price and produces standards based on what I want. In the utility space, it is the Public Utility Commission that authorizes rate recovery through integrated resource planning, and rates are not set through customer preferences, but whatever the commission wants, which hopefully aggregate customer preferences. And so when you have a legal monopolist, there are two problems that happen when you try to impose liability ex post. The first is that the company has X amount of capital. Say we're back in Duke Energy, it causes $10 billion in Clean Water Act damages, and we think usually the company should pay for this liability. If the company goes bankrupt, that means its costs go up, and some competitor takes market share. What the company can threaten to do in the utility space is say, and this is accurate, that our cost of capital will go up if you do not provide for cost recovery. So I'll go later into the paper into examples of this. But the threat is, yes, we've done this thing, it caused massive harm, but it actually may be more costly for ratepayers if you don't authorize some cost recovery, because our creditors will think we're at default risk. It will be more difficult for us to raise funds in the future. And so the regulators will say, well, shoot, we'll authorize cost recovery because it's going to be cheaper in the long run. And so you see time and again in integrated resource planning that utilities threaten rightly that, if our if we become more at greater risk of insolvency, costs for ratepayers go up anyway. So you should try to keep us healthy. And that induces regulators to increase costs. So in every single example I provided before, the executives of the rate regulated utility went to the commission and said, look, it will be more expensive to deny cost recovery than to authorize cost recovery. So if the commission wants to keep rates low, they often will balk. The second issue, which I think is more fundamental, is that a regulator's ability to plausibly commit to future deterrence is often predicated on its willingness to authorize cost recovery for past misconduct. And what I mean by this is Duke Energy did not have $10 billion in cash sitting around. It had a fairly robust capital cushion. And so the regulator was sort of thinking about how much of a loss can we impose on Duke without either forcing it to liquidate or raising its cost of capital. And what the regulator was worried about was Duke had, say, $2 billion in capital that its shareholders could be used to pay out for liability, at which point it would liquidate and there's no additional fine you can impose because it gets washed out in the bankruptcy process. And so if you said Duke should pay $1 billion of the $10 billion in liability, what that means is Duke's $2 billion capital cushion falls to $1 billion. And as a result, its cost of capital goes up in the future, but more fundamentally, it can only possibly take $1 billion in losses in the future. And so if you expect Duke to be taking risks in the future, you, in imposing liability for past misconduct, limit Duke's ability to withstand losses in the future. Now, you might say this is the case in every single industry, but it turns out that it's unique in rate-regulated industries because you have a legal right to a monopoly if you're a public utility, which means you don't have a competitor that can take market share from you when your costs go up. So if you said Duke should pay $1 billion in Clean Water Act fines, that's really easy when a competitor can say, oh, now Duke's costs are higher, we're going to eat their lunch by offering cheaper services. But that substitutability mechanism is unavailable in rate-regulated markets, meaning that the ability to commit, and so once again, those are the kind of two core challenges with regulation. And the position I hope to convince you of is that basically what that means is that because a competitor can't take market share, the company holds up the regulators and demands cost increases. So that's the broad economic thesis. With that, I'm going to quickly rewind into how do we regulate these things in case you don't have a background in this, then go into the governance point, and then go back into this and then the solutions. Hopefully not too long because I'm much more interested in the Q&A than in my own. So apologies to those of you who know this, but there are a set of classic challenges with utility regulation that have been known for about 50 years. The way this is, I keep thinking the slides are also there, but they're only there. The way that we calculate a utility's revenue is through this somewhat elaborate formula. But basically, the relevant principles are, I, as a customer, have only limited ability to go to my utility and say, I want to buy this and give me the price, and if I don't like the price, I'll go to someone else. Instead, we calculate a utility's revenue requirement, which is the total amount of money that the utility will be authorized to recover in rates. And to do that, we look at its operating costs, and we look at its capital investments. Typically, though this is a gross oversimplification, we say, you get a return on your capital investment. So you go build a generator or a transmission line, you're going to get some return on equity for that. And you just get a pass through for your operating costs. So you purchase gas if you operate a gas-fired power plant, that you will get cost recovery for, but you do not make a profit on. You just buy gas from someone who sells you gas and you pass it on to you and me. Whereas when you build a transmission line or a generator, that's a capital investment and you earn a return on that. So in the 1970s, actually starting in the 60s, there was this, people started to realize this creates really strange incentives for utilities. The first is called gold plating, or the Averick-Johnson effect, named after Harvey Averick and Leland Johnson, who wrote a paper saying, if you're a utility, what you want to do is build a bunch of stuff. You don't care if it's useful. You don't care if it provides social value. You just care that if you invest in if you make capital expenditures, you get to make more of a profit. So if you spend $100 and you have a 10% ROE, you get to recover $110 and you make a $10 profit. If you spend $1,000 at the same ROE, you get to recover, you get $1,100, meaning your profits are $100, not $10. So the more money you spend, the larger your profits. A related point that is I bring up because it's, I think, interesting, and it starts to tie into the governance point I want to make, is that even with kind of thoughtful performance-based regulation, utilities often lack an incentive to drive costs down. So often people say, why don't you authorize a larger return on equity if you meet certain benchmarks? Specifically if you cut costs, if you invest in this thing we want. And something that Jean Tirole, who's a Nobel Prize winning economist, wrote in the late 1990s was there's a game theoretic problem here. If you're a public utility, you might want, a 12% ROE for the next 4 years by reducing costs. But if you show your regulator that you can provide service at lower costs, you do something that's really bad for you, which is you disclose to your regulator that you can in fact provide service at lower cost, which means that in the next rate hearing, the regulator may further reduce your return on equity, meaning it's harder to shirk. You might only get the higher return on equity for this 1 4-year period. And so if you assume the utility is a repeat player, which it always is, and you don't have a commitment device whereby the regulator can make sure it can stick with that 12% ROE, you're really, really worried about meeting your benchmarks, because in doing so, you're disclosing to your regulator that you've been unideally efficient for the last 50 years, and you can do better in the future, which might adversely affect the rate impacts in the future. That's the reason that's relevant is it obviously ties into the holdup problem I was getting at, which is that there are all sorts of problems or reasons why regulators the utilities might not be responsive to seemingly sensible regulatory issues. So problem number one, not a me thesis, is you want to overbuild capital projects and you may not want to disclose to your regulator you can keep costs down. Next problem, I guess this should say problem two. I say problem one because this is the first one that I have thought is a me idea. So this goes back to the governance point I was making before. One, if you have a kind of self-flagellating interest in the history of public utility regulation, one of the things you'll notice is that we used to think of governance and external regulatory modes as sort of substitutes for each other. When the Roosevelt administration commissioned studies for how to regulate the energy industry, we get the Federal Power Act, which created the Federal Power Commission, which is now FERC, which looks like external regulation. But 2 of the 3 proposals for what energy regulation should look like involved various agencies participating in internal decision-making processes of public utilities. And we might think we've abandoned that, but it turns out that so one example would be PUCA, the Public Utility Holding Companies Act, which required strict separation of certain utility businesses, and actually allowed the SEC to go in and break up utilities and determine things like merger review and also executive compensation. Even now, most state commissions have authority, which typically they never use. The last year, the Minnesota Commission was so mad at Excel, they said, no Excel executive in Minnesota can make more than our highest paid state legislative officer, which seemed great except the problem is Excel is in multiple service territories, so they just made up for that in Colorado by paying themselves $10 million. But it was still kind of interesting. But the relevant point is that many state commissions have authority to weigh in on things like executive compensation, which is more akin to what we think of as governance. And so thesis number 2 is that there's actually a good theoretical reason to think governance should be on the table. Not really in the sense that I'm a pretty pro-competition person in this space, but I think the conceptual defense of distinguishing between governance and regulation doesn't apply in these industries. So to give you a whirlwind tour of 1980s University of Chicago corporate law, in 1983, Dan Fischel and Frank Easterbrook publish a book called The Economic Structure of Law. Basically, they come up with what we typically, basically a justification for giving shareholders control rights, which I completely agree with in theory. And their argument is based on the observation that shareholders are called residual claimants of corporations. And what that means, there are a couple of different definitions of it, but the core feature for them is that shareholders receive all residual profits after a company pays its fixed claimants. So you owe employees a set amount, you owe debtors, your creditors a set amount, and the shareholders, if you invent an iPhone and it turns out to be worth $1 gazillion, these shareholders are the ones who receive the financial benefit. So Easterbrook and Fischel's argument is that shareholders have unique incentives to pursue socially valuable activities, that there's actually a kind of miraculous alignment between shareholder interest and societies, because shareholders, because they profit from producing projects or engaging in projects that customers want, the shareholders are the ones who will pursue those projects. So for Easterbrook and Fischel, the reason corporations should be run by and for shareholders is because of this alignment between society's interest and shareholders' interest. Another premise of their view, which I sort of questioned at the beginning of this talk, is that external regulation is, you can deal with externalities and redistributive issues through external regulation. I've already questioned that second point in the utility context, and now I'm going to question the first point, that there's alignment between society's interest and shareholder interest. And the observation of a paper I wrote last year, and I have a successor project on now, it's called The Corporate Governance of Public Utilities, is that rate regulation converts shareholders from residual claimants to fixed claimants. If instead of having customers buy the thing you want, you have a regulatory body set price and say you will earn a 10% ROE, you can adjust it a basis point or up or down depending on how well you act. They look like creditors. They do not look like residual claimants. They might have a small incentive to do something because they get paid a little bit more, but that's very, very different from the enormous incentives you have from producing a product that just takes over the market. And so this explains in many respects why I think public utilities do not pursue socially valuable projects. If a public utility invests in wildfire mitigation beyond what's allowed in the rate schedule, they don't profit. The shareholders don't profit. It's ratepayers like you and me who enjoy that benefit. The argument is you and I are definitionally the residual claimant of public utilities. Similarly, if you reduce environmental harms to a greater extent than is authorized in the rate schedule, the shareholders have no incentive whatsoever to pursue those projects because they do not profit. Again, it's you and I as ratepayers who do. And so you can go through all of these things, but the argument is the intervention of rate regulation fundamentally alters shareholder incentives such that they do not look like or have the incentives that Easterbrook and Fischel wrote. And so this can take you in two directions. This is hopefully not super. I presented that paper at Berkeley and at Chicago a week apart. And I go to Berkeley and people are like, this is great, you're socialist, we want more government control of capital. I presented at Chicago and people say, this is great, you're Milton Friedman reborn. And I sort of think those are both sort of sensible responses in that you can take the observation to say, the government should participate more, the government or outside stakeholders like us, in corporate decision-making processes. And I don't have time to go through all of the proposals, but they would be like merger review, executive compensation, CEO hiring and firing, fiduciary duties should look slightly different. But hopefully we can talk about that in the Q&A. But there is a argument for that. The obvious challenge is the paper just brackets all of the ordinary challenges with, all of the ordinary difficulties of government regulation apply with equal force here. And so you have to have certain assumptions that the government is competent, that it will not be captured, that it will pursue these projects. And those are contingent, questionable assumptions that we can't get into in the paper. But at least as a conceptual matter, it follows. The other argument that Chicago response is, get rid of rate regulation altogether, have way more competition because you have these unique regulatory challenges that follow. And I think that's right too. The trick is there are reasons, it can be very, very difficult to finance a new nuclear reactor when we haven't built one for 30 years. Some amount of government directed capital might be necessary there. We might think these businesses are natural monopolies. So the point is, I think both of those responses are sensible and kind of track the priors of the very left Berkeley faculty and the more free market Chicago faculty. But at least the core argument is that governance is the strong kind of categorical distinction between governance and regulation doesn't seem to make sense in this industry, and that other kind of intervention should be on the table. Okay, so then we get to the holdup problem, which I think I've walked through, but is kind of the core issue I want to think about now. And to very quickly recap the two holdup problems, I think in addition to the governance and incentives to overinvest I've talked about, it is really hard to get a utility to do the right thing, even if regulators are well-intentioned, because you really, as a regulator, do not want to have your ratepayers face higher costs. And even if you wanted to deter something previously, once the utility has already done it, the possibility of not being able to deter future misconduct because the utility has a smaller capital cushion, and the possibility that rates will go up anyway because you don't authorize cost recovery and the cost of servicing debt increases, means regulators are in a uniquely difficult position. So I have two quotes. This is Tony Clark. He's a former FERC commissioner, kind of obnoxious person, which is not very important here. But this is his testimony in a Kentucky rate proceeding about whether to authorize cost recovery to Kentucky Power for about $2 billion in fuel costs that Kentucky Power incurred during Winter Storm Uri. And the reason this is sort of interesting is, like the examples I mentioned in the beginning, Kentucky Power was legally required to hedge against fuel price fluctuations. They were not, the regulator said, we authorize cost recovery for fuel costs, but we won't authorize cost recovery above a certain amount if you don't purchase some sort of insurance product that will protect you against cost increases. Turned out Kentucky Power had not hedged against this. The fuel prices that Kentucky Power had to pay during Uri were $2.1 billion. And this is Tony Clark saying, debt issued at a lower cost directly translates into customer savings via a lower weighted cost of capital and ultimately a lower overall revenue requirement. That is to say, cheaper debt costs mean lower customer rates. Now, this is obviously true. If you force a company to pay something and arguably force some loss to shareholders, your capital costs will go up. But that's sort of the definition of why we have liability, right? Liability is supposed to make your costs go up. But it is an accurate threat that if the Kentucky Commission does not authorize cost recovery, Kentucky's rates will go up to some extent in the future. And so Kentucky Power ends up receiving not $2.1 billion, but about $1.6 billion in cost recovery through something called a fuel adjustment clause in response to Winter Storm Uri. And it seems to be tied to the holdup problem that I was talking about in the beginning. This is the Duke CEO testifying before the North Carolina Commission about recovery for coal ash costs. And like Tony Clark, Lynn Good says it would be really harmful to our credit and our balance sheet would be weakened if we don't get cost recovery. So once again, it looks to me like it's a threat about your customer rates are going to go up, so you should have customers, basically ratepayers, effectively bail out the company for not being able to meet its regulatory obligations. So those are the sort of core, we can skip this. I'm going to skip all of this because I'd rather get to questions and comments. But to be very brief, one other issue is rate-regulated utilities often own businesses that participate in competitive markets. So here's one of my favorite speeches in the world. It's FDR's 1932 campaign in Portland, Oregon, which is just to show this problem goes back a long way. And he's saying one issue in the Great Depression was that utilities milked subsidiaries to keep alive the weaker sisters in the great chain, meaning essentially utilities used healthy rate-regulated affiliates to subsidize more precarious ones, and today affiliates that participate in competitive markets. So I have a project that goes over the many different ways utilities use rate-regulated affiliates to force ratepayers to take risks that their affiliates in competitive markets are in. But this is my favorite example. It's Rocky Mountain Power owns the Jim Bridger Power Station, which is a coal-fired power plant in Oregon. The Jim Bridger Power Station also owns the Jim Bridger Coal Mine, which sells coal to the Jim Bridger Power Station. And Rocky Mountain Power also owns the railroad that transports coal from the Jim Bridger coal mine to the Jim Bridger Power Station. And the only rate-regulated affiliate here is the Jim Bridger Power Station. The Jim Bridger Power Station purchases coal. It's basically authorized to receive a 9.7% ROE from its regulators. So its own profits are capped at a fairly low amount, actually. But the Jim Bridger Power Station buys coal at a 30% premium from an affiliate that it owns. And so the customers of the Jim Bridger Power Station are paying 30% more for coal, despite having no ability. This is not like a point that coal is terrible or good. It's just if you look at the price of coal across the country and you look at what the Jim Bridger Power Station is paying, it's more than the baseline price of coal. And customers obviously have no ability to protect themselves because it's just automatically passed through in operating costs. So I'm going to run through our solutions. Solution number one is we should really put governance on the table. I think I've sort of gotten to that. But if we think that ordinary regulatory mechanisms are insufficient here, it might make sense to think about who actually gets to make utility decisions. And to the extent you don't buy that, that makes sense. But then we should think, I think the solution should be, what are ways to introduce methods of competition in the energy sector? And my own view is we should try both. The next solution is, because utilities can hold up the government ex post, we need to do stress testing the way we do for financial institutions, such that we look ex ante at a utility's ability to take losses, withstand financial shocks, and actually the utility needs to have a plan about how it can reorganize such that it will not disrupt financial services and you can sell it to new shareholders. Because without some orderly reorganization process, it is actually impossible ultimately to force the debtors and shareholders to take a loss. And the final thing is that if you own a rate-regulated utility, you should not, under any circumstances, be allowed to own a company that participates in competitive markets. So I hope I didn't go on too long, but with that, I'm delighted to hear from you all.
So to ask questions, you can go to Slido, and you can do this either online or in person. And so go there. One question I saw had already been asked is, under the new administration, the new Trump administration, how might utility regulation change in your view?
So the Tony Clark actually wrote Project 25's energy section, so it's a convenient question. One of the ironies of the energy landscape right now is that the far left and the far right have converged on what they want to do and how they want to regulate this space. The far left of the academy says public utility regulation offers aggressive regulatory oversight. We should do it. The Trump administration the last time tried and failed, but they seem to have doubled down on this to resurrect aggressive public utility regulation for the obvious reason that if government sets price, expensive fossil resources are protected from competition from lower cost resources. And right now, coal is the most expensive resource. So my expectation would be a lot of backdoor subsidies through things called resource adequacy markets, which is another important part of my research, for favored generation types, and also at the extremes to sort of double down in public utility regulation through something called reliability must run agreements, RMR agreements, that take certain generators out of the market and guarantee that they receive a return, which is just another form of public utility regulation. I hope I'm wrong. I also think, I don't think this should be a partisan point, but by far the most important issue in climate change for electrification, as well as for improving reliability and reducing costs, is building a significant number of high voltage direct current interregional transmission lines. I think that one of the huge challenges is that utilities hate transmission because it exposes their generating units to competition from additional resources and basically eats up their market power. And I think we're going to have a very anti-transmission administration, but I hope I'm wrong, because we're seeing more and more catastrophic reliability challenges, and transmission is the easiest, lowest cost solution to that. But I'm really uncertain beyond that.
All right, so one question we have, Professor Macey, is why is the answer to the question of public utility dysfunction not the exclusion of private enterprises from the utility space?
Yeah, so one option is public ownership, and this is a really, so I think the core of my view is that public utility regulation is this weirdly bad socialist corporatist hybrid of socialism and free markets that's like the worst of both. And so I think that should absolutely be on the table. I think we've had bad experiences with our publicly owned utilities in the past. They were really great in the 40s when the Tennessee Valley Authority participated in rural electrification, and now it's extremely costly and poorly run. It's a hard empirical question why that's the case. But then the last thing I'll say is, one other way to think about it is that the public ownership, private ownership dichotomy may be exaggerated. And that's one of the points about governance. So with transmission, the government does not have the capability right now to build transmission lines. It simply can't hire electrical engineers they can't compete on price with the utilities, which there's an irony that they authorize rate recovery, but let's set that aside for a second. And so, but I do think if the core issue is the utilities themselves have completely misaligned incentives, you can break up the planning component and the building component, which is maybe more public ownership, except the ownership is still the private interests that have expertise here. But the idea would be the Department of Energy or FERC should plan where lines should be built, hold competitive solicitations, because that's the issue where private interests diverge. And that may or may not be public ownership. It sort of becomes a semantic question and so I guess the point is, that's a great question. I think the reality is that there are kind of complicated gradations that should be on the table as well.
Okay, so this question might relate to the last one you just answered. I'll let you decide that for yourself. Why isn't replacing the poor acting utility an option for PUCs? Or in other words, does the monopoly opportunity provide PUCs with potential alternative utilities to free it from the hostage of the bad acting utility? So
let me make sure. The question is, can we replace it?
Yeah.
Oh, I love this question. I'm actually writing. One of the many reasons I'm delighted to be in Utah is the Utah the commission asked me to write a paper with the former chair of the Kentucky Public Service Commission called "How to Kill a Public Utility." And I mean, I think they want me to change the title, but that's the working title. And the thesis of the paper is, it is possible to resolve a public utility, and we can and should be able to do so. But that sort of is the argument behind the orderly liquidation authority, PUCA kind of thing, that because of the holdup problems, if you just go in after so what the PG&E shareholders did is they just made the same cost of capital threats that they'd done before. Whereas if you do what systemically important financial institutions do, which is say, here is how we will resolve, here is how we will operate and raise capital to make sure the lights stay on while we're being reorganized, here's how we'll auction off different resources. I think that needs to be on the table, and the fact that regulators understandably are so afraid of that, given the holdup problems, has actually exacerbated the holdup problems. And the threat of forcing a utility to liquidate is maybe the most important way to actually ensure the deterrent mechanism of the other capital requirements and stress testing approaches function. That being said, and I'm not hopeful, if there's time to talk about this, I'd love to. There is this myth of something called the regulatory compact that says utilities have unique property interests in their assets, which is true in a certain sense historically, but it has never been used to say if a utility is not meeting its service obligations, it's entitled to a profit. But there is sometimes an argument that utilities are actually guaranteed a rate of return, notwithstanding all of that. And I think it's important to recognize that this weirdly Lochnerian doctrinal argument is like a vestigial remnant of a bygone constitutional era.
Okay, next question. Before disasters happen, do utilities argue that their capital cushion needs to exist to guard against disasters? If so, this makes holdout problems all the more troubling?
It's a great question. So utilities always say we need more capital, but one of the trade-offs of the capital requirement approach is rates would have to go up ex ante to make sure the utility has enough capital. One challenge right now is that we don't really police utility. So you raise rates, the utility pays a dividend. That means some amount of cash or cash-like instruments that could have absorbed a loss is unavailable. And so one thing is, I don't know if that's a holdup problem. It is a trade-off that costs will go up to some extent, but they go up hopefully in a way that over time reduces costs because we're planning for disasters and actually designing a regulatory system such that the utility can absorb losses. And the key feature is that with the capital requirements, the regulator also needs to police dividends such that you're not just raising capital requirements that's a windfall to shareholders, you're instead raising costs such that the utility can bear losses. But that's only a partial answer because I'm not trying to hide the fact that this does involve some amount of immediate cost impact to customers. I think it's an empirical question, but my guess is that that is lower than not taking precautions for fuel prices that end up being 12% of Kentucky rates for 20 years. It's just going to be lower, but it's not without its costs.
Okay, next question. What should the state utility regulator do if a monopoly public utility seeks ever higher rates but insists on burning coal and natural gas for about 3/4 of its electricity?
Oh, man. I went into this line of business to think about climate change, and I think that I don't think we can wean ourselves fully off of gas right now, but we should be able to wean ourselves fully off of coal, as even ignoring climate impacts as an economic matter. But this is a really hard political question, and I think if I could appoint my favorite commissioners and convince the country to buy into my economic preferences and climate preferences, the solutions I've proposed would address that. But I also think that these are policy decisions that we as a country have chosen to have partly belong to the federal government and partly belong to states, and that states have some authority to determine their resource mix. I think it's bad for the environment, for the climate, and for customers of Rocky Mountain Power that's the preferences here. But I think that is a political question that needs to be adjudicated in the political process, because it doesn't seem like when snooty old people say, you guys are all wrong about your political preferences, that necessarily leads to better outcomes. But no one has ever offered me a job for my political instincts is the last caveat I'll make.
Okay, so this question maybe is a companion to the last one. What should change in utility regulation to hasten the clean energy transition?
So I think that, so I'm going to broaden the question to just how should we think about electricity regulation? So which is both public utility regulation and the wholesale market process that sometimes is dealt with through utility regulation, but sometimes is dealt with through somewhat or extremely competitive wholesale markets where we pay power producers in real time and day ahead markets. And my view is that there are a set of things that have to happen in order to make a clean energy transition viable. Thing number one is that there should be some competitive process to determine what generation operates at a given moment in time. That we've seen enormous cost savings and emissions reductions when, so one problem with utility regulation in the generation side of the market is if you own a bunch of coal and gas, you really don't have as much of an incentive to invest in lower cost, lower carbon resources because you're worried you're going to strand your existing assets. And so you need some dynamic process where competitors that are willing to do that will at least pose a threat to the utility such that if there are lower cost, cleaner resources, they are willing to do so. Now, that doesn't mean huge restructuring or RTOs, but it means competitive solicitations for generation. My own view is that's actually required under FERC orders 888 and 2000, but nobody in the policy world agrees with that. The second thing is you have to fix resource adequacy markets. So both public utilities and restructured markets have a market that is basically, it's like a parking lot problem. You need to make sure that the parking lot for your grocery store has enough spaces so that at 5 p.m. when everyone goes to the grocery store, you have enough parking spaces. The core problem in electricity markets is how do you make sure that a generator that is needed once every year, once every 5 years, makes enough money to stay in the market. And without going into too much detail, this is about a third of my research scholarship, we have catastrophically screwed up resource adequacy markets. And I don't think you can have a clean energy transition without keeping the lights on. And there are really good ways to fix resource adequacy markets, but we haven't gotten there yet. And I think that this is just a crucial thing that needs to be addressed. The next thing, and this is a part of public utility regulation, is we need to build an incredible amount of transmission. The best economic studies show that this is actually going to save customer costs by reducing congestion, bringing energy prices down, even ignoring the climate impacts. But we're talking about a $140 billion capital investment over the next 5 years to build the transmission capacity we need to meet ambitious decarbonization goals. And so state commissions and public utilities have enormous leeway here. And I would hope that we can start to think about how to build those transmission assets. I think after that, any sort of decarbonization policy is far more effective. And we should couple it with that. But getting those three things right, I think is a necessary requirement of any energy transition. But each of those things is enormously controversial and has yet to be pursued aggressively. Beyond that, I think the subsidies and carbon taxes we have are helpful, but the cost of a carbon tax or a clean energy subsidy, you can get far more emissions, far less expensively once you do those three things. And given that wind and solar are already extremely cheap, that there seems to be corporate appetite for small modular nuclear reactors now, it does seem that there's a demand and we just need to create the conditions to realize that.
Okay, so two last questions. You mentioned utility corporate governance could help fix your problem number one. What tools do you think would be the most effective in doing that? So I kind of like the idea that like Lincoln could be on the board of Rocky Mountain Power and that he should be as a ratepayer. And maybe that would be the exception, but I don't think that is the most significant lever of corporate governance. At the end of the day, it's majority voting. Also, at the end of the day, I'm not confident that
we as voters or ratepayers would elect the Lincolns of the world. We might, elect someone like me who would just screw everything up. But the things I think are relevant are, I think that hiring and firing decisions, executive compensation tied to meeting certain metrics tied to reliability and decarbonization are highly consequential. I also think that fiduciary duties right now are a weak tool. One thing I skipped over because of time concerns is that in the coal ash spill, Duke Power, some of its shareholders sued for breach of fiduciary duty, which means, but because fiduciary duties are owed to shareholders, the Delaware Chancery Court threw out the case saying, you haven't shown any harm because there was cost recovery. And so I do think that it's similar to executive compensation, but having the ability to directly sue corporate managers for misconduct that harms ratepayers rather than shareholders is another lever that could be effective. And finally, merger review under some definitions is a part of corporate governance. And I think we should be far more skeptical of utility mergers, because why would a utility that has a regulatorily authorized revenue buy another one that has the same issue? It can't be because the regulator is going to raise revenue unless you just think you're better able to capture your regulator, or because you can redistribute value to non-rate regulated affiliates, both of which are, I'm actually a supporter of extremely lenient merger review, but that's because ordinarily we think shareholders can determine whether a merger will be efficient, because if they vote to accept the premium offered by the acquirer, if you don't show anti-competitive harm, that suggests there are greater efficiencies. But that entire approach doesn't make any sense when the regulator determines your return on equity. And so stricter merger review is the final option.
Okay, so last question. Isn't it hard to make utilities incur liabilities for big disasters like wildfires and hurricanes, because we need the utility to keep operating and providing energy to the public?
Yep, absolutely. And this is why the orderly liquidation, the resolution mechanisms are absolutely crucial. So we need, during a financial crisis, we can't have the financial system stop, right? The core challenge in financial services is when you have a run, you still need financial services. And so the orderly liquidation authority, which is Dodd-Frank's approach to resolving systemically important financial institutions, requires that they have a plan that shows how they will continue to operate. And in fact, usually that plan is the FDIC will lend you on an emergency basis so that you do, under no circumstances, stop operating. And I think we should wipe out shareholders and determine and make sure that old creditors are wiped out to the extent they should be. But we need a mechanism for the Department of Energy to lend on an emergency basis such that that catastrophic possibility can't happen. And that's the possibility, that threat is one of the reasons I think utilities often balk at not authorizing rate recovery. And I think that is, it's actually, they're not wrong about that. We need some liquidation mechanism to make sure that they do a better job.
All right, and with that, I have two thank yous and one invitation for you all. First, please join with me in thanking our 20th annual Stegner Young Scholar, Joshua Macey. I also want to again thank the Cultural Vision Fund for its incredible support of this important program for 20 years, our sole and founding sponsor. And then finally, an invitation. I hope to see you all back here in 2 weeks for our green bag on a watershed moment, the West and the Age of Limits. But also on your way out, please take a moment to get a cookie to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Stegner Young Scholar. Thank you all and have a good afternoon.